it's incredibly hard to put in place. If you're a doctor, you don't receive really training. As a neurologist, you receive an hour on migraine in your curriculum. As a doctor, GP, I don't think you receive much. And so this is not something that we really teach or that we're really familiar to do clinically.
I'm Anne-Marie McQueen, journalist and proud 50-ish woman, and we are here looking for the true truth in perimenopause, menopause, midlife, and beyond.
Opening our minds to other possibilities is not always easy.
Hotflash Inc.
You're all woman to me. All right, Anne-Marie.
My mom used to pass out from migraines.
Wow.
She used to pass out on the spot. I don't know if that happens to very many people, but we'd be watching TV and we'd hear my mom just pass out.
Yeah, it must be. How did you feel as a child?
It's terrifying. I think I've probably walled off how I feel about it, but it's terrifying to see your mom collapse. And then when she had migraines, it could just be a really long time in my memory, and just seeing her in so much pain, but you can't feel someone else's pain either. So it's a very difficult thing.
That is very true. And I really want to stay on your mom just for a minute, because I think it's going to speak so much to your audience. And then what would happen to your mom? Would she go to bed, or how would you as a family sort of handle the situation?
She would be in bed, and they think this was in my life for a very long time because, I think she had them for a very long time. But yeah, she would go to bed. She would go to bed for a long time during the day, and it would be a while. It's very hard for me to remember, but it would be a while. And I just remember these passing out moments. Yeah, it was crazy. Absolutely. She was in so much pain. Yeah. She took serious painkillers too. Like in those days, they prescribed you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And those times haven't changed that much. People will get prescribed stronger and stronger medication, and also be recommended to use medication cocktails. So a combination of medication in the hope that something's going to work.
So first of all, how did you get involved in this? I'm assuming you have them yourself.
That's a great assumption. It's actually my sister who was having them. My sister was having migraines, and it's at the time when my uncle got diagnosed with glioblastoma, which is an extremely violent form of brain tumor and cancer. And my uncle had a tumor that grew from the size of a pebble to the size of an orange within a couple of weeks. And he got operated once and ended up dying. It was very violent, very short, and he had 4 children. It was completely traumatizing in the family. This was in 2015, and at that time, so 10 years ago, my sister took me apart and said, I think I'm going to have the same. And I'm like, why do you think that? It's because I've had migraines for the last 3 years, and I keep on going to the radiologist, and I do these MRI and CT scan, and they tell me they don't see anything. This is really hurt so much. I really don't know what to do. And I told her, I think I know someone who can help. I don't think you have necessarily that, but there's clearly something going on with your body. Let's try to find out. And so together we wrote 3 pages document to Dr. Zhang that I sent her via email. I had known Dr. Zhang because I had lived in China, and we spoke with her for an hour. Dr. Zhang explained the underlying imbalances that my sister was having, recommended a couple of foods, and 4 months later, my sister no longer had migraines. And I never thought of anything because I had never really paid attention. I'm not a saint. I was like one of these humans that you tell them you have a migraine, and I was like the evil that thinks you said you had a headache because that's the only thing I can relate to. Now I'm someone who's super empathetic. You just don't imagine what people actually mean when they tell you that. And so I didn't think much of it until my neighbor, fast forward, I was living in New Zealand. My neighbor tells me, Diane, I've had a really difficult conversation with my dad. I'm like, what is it about? I can see you're completely off. And she says, I've had migraine for the last 7 years. I'm like, I'm sorry, I never knew this about you. And she says, I usually don't mention because what can you do? And she says, my father tells me now that I need to get medicated for life, including having injections. And I don't think I want to have injections. And I'm like, injections where? She tells me injections in the leg or injections in the brain. I'm like, oh, come on. That sounds so much and so crazy. Of course, don't do that. That sounds almost dangerous.
Of what? Can I interrupt you and just say,
yes,
what are the injections?
In 2019, in December 2019, the FDA approved a new class of medication, which is the first class of medication that was approved and done for migraine disease. Before that, all the medication that your mom must have taken were medication that had been invented for other problems, such as cardiovascular diseases, seizure, or cardiovascular issues that turned out to also somewhat work at some level for some time for some people. And here was just a new class of medication that her father was recommending that she has. But I didn't know that. And I told her, look, I know someone a long time ago. I helped my sister through a doctor in China. You've lived in Beijing, right? Why don't I WhatsApp you a little and WeChat her a little, ask you a couple of questions, and I'm pretty sure we can try something different. And then if in 6 months it doesn't work, then you have still 49.5 years to do your injections, whatever they are. And 4 months later, she no longer had migraines. And I asked her, why did your father tell you that? And she says, my father is a neurologist. And I thought, oh, that doesn't make any sense. What? Wow. Like I was so out of my league to even stand in the way of that. And then I really thought, wow, clearly, if you come from New York and your father's your neurologist, clearly the guy's super smart. And clearly he loves you, he cares, he's listening. So I must be very close in what I've recommended as food to medication. And so this is where I opened my laptop and for the first time, I started to search migraine and I discovered and like a world that just I had no idea of its existence. It was just incredible. It was like all of your mums times millions of people on walls like, complaining about the pain and about the pain for years and years. And I really thought that didn't make sense. And I started to search scientific papers, and the scientific papers were saying it was genetic. It was 18% of women. I thought, 18% of women? Oh my God, how a bad friend must I have been for so many years, not listening properly to my friends. And I started to go into the scientific papers. And what really struck my mind is that the medication, they were painkillers. They were aiming to silence the pain. Whereas what I had tried to do was listen to it and attend to it. And I really thought, oh, something's really off here. That's how I started.
Wow. Okay. I don't even know what to get into, but what does mainstream medicine get wrong?
So let me give you an analogy. If you take, for example, a child and you say, oh, my 3-year-old is independent and for the first time is taking, let's take my girl and she's taking her shower for the first time alone. And she, on the way out of the shower, she jams her finger in the door and she starts crying. You go to the doctor and you say, my daughter cries. And he says, oh, I'm sorry for that. Let me give you some earplugs. You put one to the left, one to the right. You go back home and you should be able to function. So you do that and you go back home and you're like, oh, yeah, that makes less noise. I'm able to do my laundry and my cooking, etc. What is your daughter going to do? She's going to cry louder. So you go back to the doctor and you say, oh, I'm sorry. She cries louder now. He says, oh, that can happen. Let me give you a Bose headset with noise canceling. That should be a lot better. You go back home and initially it works. But then what is she going to do? She's going to start to slam on the door or shut in the door with her foot. And you're thinking, wow, and now my house is trembling. When what you need to do is to go towards her, put a knee on the ground, look at her and say, I'm sorry, darling, what's happening? And then she's just going to show you her finger. Oh, I can see you locked your finger. Just show it to mommy. Okay, let me open the door. Let me put a Band-Aid, then give you a hug and then feed you. And when your knee hurts, you go to the doctor. Let's imagine you broke it. You go to the doctor, you hope for something else than painkillers, right? Maybe some for the moment, right? And I respect highly the profession of doctor, and they're really important and you need to be diagnosed. However, if your doctor for your knee broken, all that he gives you is painkiller, your knee is going to be dysfunctioning for the rest of your life. It's quite similar with the brain. You need to know what is the brain saying. And because it's more complex, it's a bit harder to read, yet it's as logical as your knee.
So is this another situation of the body whispers to you or it talks to you? And is it a suggestion of a physical problem or is it a suggestion of an emotional problem or both?
Great question. Sometimes one, sometimes the other, sometimes both. Absolutely. You can have, for example, let's start with the emotions. You can have a situation in which you have a child who's been abused physically, mentally, or neglected by parents, not loved, and starts to have the vagus nerve, which starts to go in fight, flight, or fight a lot and doesn't rest and digest. all of that gut-brain axis. And so if you imagine the vagus nerve as a gigantic tree that plants its roots around your heart, around your stomach, around your liver, around your kidney, and then forms a trunk in your neck and plugs in a bit like an electric car, an electric plug in your brain. And we lose a bit, because of the density of the brain, we lose a bit the link between those wires and the organs in the brain. Let's imagine this big vagus nerve is going to be quite damaged. And so now in the Western science, we've been able to prove that when children go through trauma, there will be alteration of their vagus nerve. And then from there are going to start a domino effect of migraine that are going to initially be purely emotional, but very quickly will become physiological. If it's in your head, it's in your body. Now, sometimes things can start the other way around, where, for example, you lost a lot of blood. For example, you donated blood, or you lost a lot of blood in birth, or you've put a copper IUD and you lost a lot of... In her lifetime, a woman is going to lose 23 to 28 liters of menstruation. That's just the average woman. Let me repeat it. It's 23 to 28 liters. If she doesn't make her blood as fast, or her menstruation matter as fast as she loses it, then her brain becomes in competition with her digestive system and her limbs for blood. And because the brain sucks up 20% of energy and is only 2 to 6% of weight, when you don't have enough physical blood volume, then your body starts to arbitrage. So then you can take a triptan, for example, contract your blood vessels, and the blood goes back to your brain, but you don't feel completely yourself. So it can come physiologically or physically.
Is there research on this in the sort of mainstream scientific community, or who's putting this all together?
A great question. Fantastic question. Actually, in the scientific community, it does exist. If you search on some of the most important and prevalent journals, you search for the link between the gut-brain axis and migraine on migraine and the microbiota. You look for evidence between magnesium, CoQ10, omega-3s, and migraine. You'll find plenty, a plethora of really solid scientific articles dating back all the way sometimes to 1985. Now, because it's complex, it's not because it's been tested or proven scientifically or written about that it's practiced. I think in practice, it's incredibly hard to put in place. If you're a doctor, you don't receive really training. As a neurologist, you receive an hour on migraine in your curriculum. As a doctor, GP, I don't think you receive much. And so this is not something that we really teach or that we're really familiar to do clinically. It's something that we've analyzed and intellectually discussed. And intellectually, we discuss more and more, but not necessarily that we implement, if that makes sense.
It all makes sense. And it's reminding me of IBS and other conditions where they're just like labeled, but they're coming from trauma and things that need to be addressed inside you. When you're speaking, I'm thinking about my mom a lot because she had a lot of physical problems her whole life. And they were like, I always think what happened when she was a kid. I've only in the last couple of years, as I put the trauma piece together, have I become more convinced that something happened when she was a child, but she died early at 53, but it was just a parade of things. And I never even thought about the migraine piece. But when you mention that, you're crying out for help. But I know that someone listening to this there's such a divide, like the all in your head thing is still very much rooted, right? So I can feel that people who have this pain would be very resistant to the notion. And so can you just speak a bit to this is physical pain, but it could be coming from an emotional place. How does that, the vagus
How does that
nerve,
reconcile?
we've only just figured out about the vagus nerve and been able to see in our body how that could be happening. But where's the switch for a migraine?
Yeah, absolutely. In the East, emotions have always been a part of medicine. And in fact, when you wanted to qualify as a doctor in ancient China, you would need two qualities. One was intellect, and in particular, literacy. You need to be able to read all articles. The second one you need was empathy, because you needed to also dig up for those pieces of the puzzle. Sometimes the puzzle would be purely biological, and sometimes the piece of the puzzle would be emotional. And your role as an investigator is to find where is the problem being caused. Sometimes the root cause of a migraine can be an individual external to your body. It can be a very toxic boss. It can be a toxic friend. It can be a very difficult uncoupling. Yeah. And so emotions will relate to different systems. And so I speak 7 languages, and it's a bit like I only speak 2. I speak West and I speak Mandarin. And in West, when you say liver system, liver, you designate the piece of flesh that is at the bottom of your right rib cage, always, regarding that it's in Italian, in Spanish, in German. It's always that. When you say liver in Mandarin, which is gan, when you say gan, you don't mean that. You mean liver and gallbladder and all of your female hormones and all of your mood hormones and all of the liquids that irrigate your tendons and your breast and your uterus and your ability to detox and your emotion of anger and absence of patience, resentment, frustration. Okay. And so the more the person is going to have a situation that makes them angry, the more their liver is going to be intoxicated, the more, if they have migraine disease or migraine genetic profile, their genetic profile is going to indicate in their brain through the vagus nerve that the liver has inflammation. The more you have that, the more you medicate. The more you medicate, the more you have toxicity in your liver. The more you have toxicity in your liver, the more you feel angry. And so there's a chicken and egg between the emotions and the organs. In the West, we've discovered the gut-brain axis and the bidirectionality, meaning my brain communicates with my gut and my gut communicates with my brain. But in fact, there's an emotion to gut or an emotion to organ axis as well that was yet to completely admit, I think, in the West. Yeah, we still were marching, but marching very slowly.
So what's the hormonal link? Because a lot of women find this torques up in perimenopause. But I'm wondering also if it's just that hormones receding, the hormones that protect you, that bring everything to the surface, including the inner child experiences that you're not addressing.
Great questions. So many places. Let's dive in. So with hormones, women will notice that they can have migraine that will follow their hormones. So some of them will say, I always have my migraines before my menstruation. It's really the time when it hits me. I have maybe sore breast. I also have anger and resentment. I also maybe have a bit more acid reflux or something like that, or trembling sensations or numbness in my arms and legs. And at that time, I'm going to have more migraines. Some of them will say, oh, for me, it always hits after my menstruation. Some of them will say it's during ovulation, so mid of the cycle. And some of them will say, oh, actually, for me, it's really hard during my menstruation. And some will say all of the above, and can also say it starts a few days before my menstruation, but it leads all the way to a few days after. And here it's not one block, it's actually multiple different migraine. And so indeed, the hormones will play a very, very significant role in those different types of migraine. As the woman goes through perimenopause, we're adding a layer of complexity because her liver is going to lose up to 44% of its volume, according to Western science. So now if you think back of my liver, does my detox, my emotions, all of my female hormones, my mood hormones, my tendons, my breast, my uterus, all of that loses a bit of its magic power. And so we're going to have a liver that produces less hormone, the liver system, and we're going to have less of these very brilliant liquids that transport these hormones and that also hydrate my brain, that can make my brain is more and more dizzy and give me something called Meniere's disease. So because of some women, they're going to have less migraines after menopause. And so some women will actually impose themselves a hysterectomy in the hope to get rid of the migraines, because this is so awful. Let's just accelerate the process, get rid of that uterus, and hopefully it stops. But in a lot of cases, they will actually accelerate after menopause. And so they realize once the operation has been done, then it still doesn't help.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. What about progesterone? Because I have heard a lot about progesterone and migraine and PMS.
Yes. So progesterone links specifically in traditional Chinese medicine to what is called the kidney yang. And so this is something the progesterone is going to, together with the estrogen, is going to start to decrease. Now, in the East, we think of perimenopause as a second spring. And we say second spring because it's an opportunity to reinvent yourself, completely reinvent yourself. And it's really a moment where there's a window of menstruation closing, where the body is going to try to deal with all past trauma and emotions. And it's really important to talk about because one of the things I've realized, and I'm going to answer your question in a minute, one of the things I've realized is that sometimes in trauma, women can hold their emotion in form of tissues. So bear with me. So they've had so many emotional blockages that those created tissues that can be a form of fibroid cysts, unwanted tissues and blood clots in the uterus that they will need to expel. And when they menstruate, they're in pain, massive pain. They have migraine pain because the vagus nerve is picking up that while it's contracting in the uterus, that's a hypothesis, the migraine is expressing itself. And so the way out of this is to expel the unwanted tissues. Now, through the perimenopause, the woman has a window of opportunity in order to deal with past stuff. And this is why the East calls it also second spring. It's a moment to reinvent yourself, a moment to reevaluate, to reconsider, a moment to shed your skin and become your true you. I was doing a podcast just before with a woman who was 61, and she says, for the first time after 55 years, I no longer have migraines. I've had to do a lot of work on my past trauma and my life and my body, but I've never been happier. And so she doesn't have to be 60. She gets to be 60. And so that's a beautiful image that in the East, and there's an aspiration of you don't have to go through perimenopause. You get to shed those tears, shed this skin, those problems. And so as the window of menstruation closes, the body feels an urgency to clear everything. Now, in the process, the body is going to have its both estrogen and progesterone slow down. The whole goal here is to keep the balance in between these different organs and systems to allow them to land very peacefully, because then we can have an absence of massive symptoms and hot flashes, etc. And here, the progesterone is going to be a result of the kidney system slowing down in its intervention and therefore decreasing the progesterone. Now, we need to have the estrogen decrease in parallel at the same time. And that's what's going to allow for not having too much anxiety. As the progesterone slows down, we can have more kidney deficiency. Kidney deficiency is translated by more anxiety, more stress, a bit more difficulty to make decisions, the hair getting thinner, more gray, more lost, a bit more fatigue, and the fluids in my body not as strong as they used to be. And therefore, my libido also decreasing a little bit. Yeah. And so it's just that soft landing. So the body is trying to have a soft landing, and it's not, you lose a superpower, but you gain a new one too. On the other end, when you have gone through full menopause, you are back to where you were as a child with daily cycle. And that also brings comfort. And if you've been able to clean the entire orchestra of your life and of the events of your life, then you are like my friend Pat, you are happier, even though you are wiser or older, or you have just more years under your belt, and you got ready and the teacher came and life became suddenly way easier and way happier. It's something to look forward to.
Yeah, I'm on the other side of it. I'm 54, almost 55. And I get really upset when people talk about it and the way that they talk about it, because I did all that painful stuff. It's incredibly painful. You're forced to, it's like you're on the floor, like writhing, and then you just come out of it. It takes a couple of years. So it's really tough.
Yeah.
In there, you mentioned estrogen, and you said hopefully estrogen is falling at the same time. But I think we know that estrogen is rising and falling and can be quite high. And so I don't know how that plays into the migraine equation and the imbalance.
Yeah, a lot actually. The estrogen is going to be, they're both going to circulate in something called the yin. So in the West, we obsess about the hormones. In the East, it is said that the hormones are a consequence. So they're not the root cause. There's something deeper to the layer than the progesterone and the estrogen. And so they surf on a type of liquid called yin. So in the West, we say that the body is 60% water, that the brain is 74% water, that the lungs, I think it's 83, and the kidney 69. We actually computed that in labs. It's very scientific, very serious. In the East, they're going to call it yin, and think of yin and these liquids more as brain, bone marrow, lymphatic system, and intra-organ liquids, which we have recently discovered. There's a beautiful article written in the journal Nature on this new body part that we've recently discovered in the West. It dates back a couple of years, called the interstitium, which are liquids that circulate in between my organs, and that explain a lot of perimenopause and menopause issues. It's fascinating. We just discovered it in the West, and it's been existing all along in the East. And in the West, we've accused the East that it didn't exist. It's a really interesting dynamic. That's why we didn't, when we made that finding, we didn't shout it from the rooftop, not yet. I think we'll be able in the future, that's my prediction, that we'll be able in the future to use this to stop cancer from spreading. And this is the moment when this knowledge will become very mainstream. Now, if you Google it, you will find a lot of articles on it, a lot of podcasts on it. It's called the interstitium. And so in this interstitium, which is essentially, imagine a massive spaghetti that circulate around your organs and allow for the hormones and the fluids to circulate, you have a lot of yin, and in that yin circulates the estrogen and the progesterone. But that liquid is very precious and is decreasing with time, which causes all of these imbalances.
Yeah, wow. My jaw is open because you said in the West we obsess about hormones, and it's so true, right? It's just like hormones. This is a complete hormone discussion. You have estrogen. You see it all the time, estrogen receptors, and then they're just sitting there empty, like gaping, gasping for estrogen. And now you're saying there's a whole different thing that's been discovered. And so if you have your hormones tested, that the hormones in there aren't going to show up. You're having your blood tested. That's when we talk about hormones in different tissues of the body. There's still hormones in those parts of the body, right? If there is an interstitium, and you're not able to test what's in there with any test.
Yeah, we just discovered it. Like, you honestly, in the West, they're like, oh my God, what is this? So there was a German dermatologist who was wondering, okay, how come some of my patients have the melanoma go through and generalize in the body versus some it just stays on the skin? What is the difference between those two types of individual? And he didn't believe in the way that the cancer cells would butcher their way through into the other organs. He didn't think it was, the theory at the time had legs. He thought there must be some other ways. It's too complicated for a cell to do that. And so he tested on rats and gave a number of rats melanoma. And he could observe that in some rats, the liquid, the melanoma, would vary in the space of very little time, would spread throughout the body very smoothly. And it was following a network he had never seen before. That's how it came discovered. And then at the same time, in the US, there was another doctor just observing bile duct under the microscope. And he saw the same thing. He was finding there were small hexagons around the bile duct. And he was just trying to observe where does that go, and saw some fluids, and again following a network he had never seen. That's how even in the journal Nature they discuss about what is this unrecognized body part that we suddenly discover that manages 20 to 25% of the body fluids. That's a lot, 20 to 25. And in there, they said it looks very viscous. There's a lot of collagen, a lot of hyaluronic acid, and hormones. And I think that in the West, we understand the male body. The female body is not a proxy of a male body. And so if you don't understand the interstitium, you can't fully, in my personal, humble opinion, completely understand the rest of the equation and fully, with a Western mind, very detailed orientated, understand hormones with a really high level of granularity.
Sounds like you can't really understand
Yeah.
perimenopause or menopause either.
I find that the more I go west, the more I turn back east because we can't, but yes, we can. Because a lot of people have been doing this. So why we're discovering it just now and not really sharing that we've discovered it because, we're not sure. It's been, discovered and talked about over and over in the East for thousands of years. It's always been there. It's just that in the West, we thought this is a made up organ. We opened and butchered a body. There is no such thing inside. Now, how does that relate to migraine? Because when you are going to perimenopause and menopause, then it is possible that these liquids will start to dry, which is something that the yeast is going to always fight, that dryness that makes us stop bleeding and start to wrinkle and start to have vaginal dryness. So if you think of a tree and a woman, you compare the vagus nerve and the woman as a tree, you'd say in childhood it's springtime and the tree is growing and beautiful. In summertime it gives fruits and we're pregnant and we have milk and we have 2 heartbeats and 2 brain, etc. And then through perimenopause we go through autumn, and so we dry. Where do we dry? We dry on our skin, on our face, we dry in our menstruation, we have vaginal dryness. And therefore, we have hot flushes because we're not able to regulate our internal temperature anymore. So it doesn't look at it like an excess, but as a deficiency. And the way you fight it is by rebalancing that. Now, if you have a migraine genetic predisposition, then you will suffer from a lot of dizziness, a lot of fogginess, a mind that is less and less clear by the day. And then you add medication on top of it, some of which end up there. That makes the whole system very complicated and the brain very angry.
Okay, so when that doctor helped your sister, what were some of the things that she did?
It was understanding where is my sister at that time was young. She was a young mom of 3 children and she was just out of balance. When you give birth through to, let's face it, 3 brains, 3 sets of eyes, 3 hearts, 3 sets of bones, 3 sets of hair, 3 sets of nails, and you receive from your husband 3 cells, of course, you're exhausted and your body is depleted. I think in the West, when a woman goes through pregnancy, on the back of pregnancy, what do we expect from you? We expect you to lose your weight, to welcome your in-laws, to write your announcement cards, and to take care of the baby, and to still be a good wife. In the East, we expect you to lay in bed for a month and to be served by others, to just feed your child and receive good food, to let your organs go back in their shape and their place, to avoid incontinence much later in life. And so it's a very different attitude. And so, of course, if you're a mom of 3 and you're exhausted, then your body is just simply depleted. And sometimes it's as simple as that. In the case of my neighbor, it was more if you have headaches for a really long time and they transform into migraine, you're going to slowly upgrade in terms of medication, have more and more toxicity. The more you have migraine, the more you take medication, the more you take medication, the more you have toxicity. The more you have toxicity, the more you have migraine. Because the migraines start in many parts from just initially toxins. Now, there's, of course, a domino effect because the systems are very interdependent.
Yeah.
And so this is how we transform migraine sufferers who will suffer for 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years into migraine heroes who master their emotions, their genetics, their body to live a really happy, grounded life where they don't fear their genetics. They embrace it as more of a radar and a tool for longevity than a curse. And a lot of them will be very scared of having even children to pass on those genes because it's such a hard life to live.
So you have tools. If someone's listening to this and they're thinking, yeah, this resonates, I've got to do something, like this sounds like something I can do, what are they going to find?
So you go on the App Store or on Google Play, you can download an app called Migraine Heroes. And you can basically meet with me. I'm going to ask you about 100 questions, and then we meet for 90 minutes to first understand why is your brain in pain from the first onset of migraine all the way to now. what domino effects took place that are both physiological and emotional elements in your life that led to that massive pain that you experience. So if I think and compare to your mom, it would be sitting with your mom and saying, hey, can you tell me the digestion issues? Can we talk about it? You did have IBS, you had leaky gut, you have acid reflux. Okay, all of that, it matters because your vagus nerve is grumpy about it. And so we're going to need to repair things one by one. And so the way I work is I don't remove food, I add food. And by adding food, you can rebalance. And as the body rebalances, not only do the migraine go in intensity and frequency, they decrease. And you'll see plenty of testimonials because people are just overjoyed, not because they're, and so your symptoms also decrease. The digestion issues, they come back in order, the anxiety goes, etc. And back to your first questions on emotion, sometimes we use judgment and say, okay, this person also needs a bit of help. So you go on the app, it's called Migraine Heroes. The website's going to be called very quickly migraineheroes.com as well. You can do your thorough due diligence and you'll see just a lot of work is love made visible, just a lot of love from all angles.
How did it work? Did you study this after you found out about this, or were you already studying it? Because I know you've studied traditional Chinese medicine in addition to the other things. Yeah.
Yeah, so I started a completely classic career. I actually am an engineer by background and I studied at Harvard and I studied business at Harvard. But I had a skiing accident myself. I lost half of my blood. I shrunk a kidney and I never was transfused. And so even though I did not have migraines, I had a lot of physical complications that really resemble a lot of what the people I work with go through. And that doctor, she changed my life in 3 weeks and 14 foods. And I was like, what? How can you do that after 12 years of me limping? And I was in shock. I was like, how did she do that? I went back to work. All of my male colleagues told me, Diane, it's placebo. And I thought, oh my God, guys, if you knew, like my cycles are back to where they were when I was 17. I can't placebo. That doesn't exist. Anyway, I was really intrigued. So I had started to study with her actually before. And I studied more and more, and she's helped me to develop all of that. She's 72, Dr. Yifang Zhang. She comes from a descent of traditional Chinese medicine doctors. We've developed everything together. And so whenever I was having difficult cases, and still once a month I'm like, oh, I have 3 really unusual situations. Can you help me clarify? It goes usually way beyond migraine. We exchange, and it's an amazing knowledge that is passed on from her family that we've assembled as an AI with Western science, because we need to know which medication you take. Everything we do is medication compatible. We want to respect your medication and let it act where it acts. You manage your pain. Our job is that you have no more pain. And as you don't have pain anymore, then you can revise with your doctor your medication regime. And most people decrease it. Usually doctors will spontaneously say, oh, your thyroid's better. Let's just cut it in half. Your mood seems better. I think we can cut the antidepressants by half. Let's see if we can cut them all together. And as that happens, then people feel a lot more in control and again, go from being migraine sufferers to migraine heroes.
It reminds me a lot of my experiences with IBS, just trying to get help and then finally finding a doctor who spent an hour and a half talking to me about my entire life and every part of me. So many women just bounce around being treated like body parts. You must hear these stories all the time.
It's so true. What, like having body parts issue and being bounced around for one doctor, one body part, just constant. And it's a really long quest for them. Really long. Yeah. So I always tell people, I'm like, I hope and I think I'm your last person. And we do everything in our power. This is where it's very different. I think our goal, first and foremost, is to solve the issue. And so we've gone over mountains. Now, even inside the app, so there's an app, right? There's a chat with real humans. You don't have an app like that. It's a really bad idea if you want to try to make money. Don't do that. That's stupid. If you try to solve people issues, then it's a really good idea. We even have an AI chat whose job is just to service people. If it's 2 a.m. and you have a massive migraine attack, we have a migraine now button that is going to guide you through, okay, what to do now. It's 2 a.m. What is this migraine about? And it's going to ask you questions and then help you navigate to what is causing this migraine in this very specific moment and what can you do to abort it and stop it in flight so that it doesn't develop and last for 3 days so that you can go back to your children and take care of them and just be a mom and do the small and really large things that you want to achieve in life.
It's a part of personalized medicine because this is walking you through all the different things. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it too.
Hotflash Inc. was created and is hosted by Anne-Marie McQueen, produced and edited by Sonia Mack. The information contained in this podcast is intended for informational purposes only and is not intended for the purpose of diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Before using any products referenced on the podcast, consult with your healthcare provider, read all labels, and heed all directions and cautions that accompany the products. Information received through the podcast should not be used in place of a consultation or advice from a healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem, i.e. menopause or anything else, or any healthcare questions, please promptly see your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Anne-Marie McQueen and any producers or editors, disclaim any responsibility from any possible adverse effects from the use of any information contained herein. Opinions of guests on this podcast are their own, and the podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about a guest's qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. This podcast is owned by Hotflash Inc. Media.